I apologize in advance to anyone who may be triggered by the story I am about to tell you all. After I graduated from college about 5 years ago with a degree in finance, I started a job at a bank as a teller. It wasn't exactly the job I wanted, but it was a start. I enjoyed my job very much, mainly because of the customers, some of whom came in regularly. My coworkers also made the job fun, and I enjoyed working with them very much. One of my coworkers, who we will call Tiffany, was also a teller, which meant we made the same amount of money. I must admit, as a teller, we didn't make a lot of money at all. Somehow, Tiffany had a very expensive car and always wore expensive shoes and purses to work. She even gave me a very expensive bottle of champagne for my birthday one year. When I showed it to my mom, she said that bottle was about $500. Tiffany and I became very friendly with each other and would sometimes go out to happy hour. She finally felt like she could trust me and began telling me about a guy that she was dating. She said he spoiled her, and he was the one who was lavishing her with all of the expensive things she had. I was so jealous. She appeared to have everything I wanted. One day I asked her what he did for a living, and she confided in me and told me that he didn't have a traditional job. When I asked what that meant, she explained to me that he was a credit card scammer. I couldn't believe it. He didn't seem like the kind of guy Tiffany would date. I tried not to judge her, but I could not help but wonder how someone like her could date a guy like that. One day Tiffany called into work sick, which was a bit unusual because since I had known her, she had never called into work sick before. She had perfect attendance. She even had better attendance than our manager, which we often joked about. Everyone thought she must have been extremely sick to call out. At about 10 o'clock, a couple walked into the bank dressed very elegantly. The man disarmed the guard who stood by the door and told everyone to get on the floor and not to make a sound while he pointed a weapon at us. They wore masks, and all that we could see were their eyes. The woman brought me to my feet and walked me to where we kept the money. She didn't speak. She handed me a note instead. The note said, "Please put as much money as you can in this bag in only 20s. Do not put any die packs in the bag. Do not press the panic button. We will hurt you if we have to." I packed the money into the large designer purse that she gave me. I noticed something very familiar about the purse. It had engraved initials on one of the straps matching Tiffany's initials. I looked at her hand and noticed the woman was wearing the same exact bracelet that Tiffany wore every day. I knew at that moment that the female bank robber was my coworker. I immediately looked up at her and we made eye contact. Another distinct feature about Tiffany were her bright blue eyes. I couldn't see the entire face behind the mask, but I knew those blue eyes. As I looked into her eyes, she looked away, and her and the male bank robber left the bank. After the robbers left, my manager hit the panic button, and when the police arrived, they took our statements. I told the police I thought one of the robbers was my coworker, Tiffany. It turns out that the manager also thought it may have been Tiffany. After her and her boyfriend left the bank, they went to Tiffany's house where the police were already waiting for them. They were caught with a bag of money and wearing the same exact clothes they had worn during the robbery. I never spoke to Tiffany again, and everyone who worked at the bank had testified at her trial, which was super awkward. I felt like I was betraying a friend, but I knew I had done the right thing by telling the truth. At her sentencing, Tiffany apologized to all the victims of her crime and especially to me. Thanks for listening to my story. Stay spooked.
This story was sent to us from Roger in Michigan. This happened to me about 6 months ago while I was working at chemical plant in the warehouse as a forklift operator. I was told by my manager that there was a new employee who would be starting that morning and I was going to be training him for the next 2 weeks. Let's call the new guy Brian. I met Brian, who was much younger than me. He was young enough to be my son, so somewhere between 19 and 23. He seemed a little immature but very strong and learned quickly. Around lunchtime, I told him that some of the guys ate in their cars or left the building for lunch, but I usually went to the lunchroom. I told him that he was more than welcome to sit with me if he wanted to. He sat down with me in the lunchroom, and right away he began asking about one of the other guys who also worked at the plant. I sort of knew the guy he was asking about, but I didn't know him too well because he didn't work in the warehouse, he worked in another department. I asked him why he was so curious about this guy, and he said that he was his cousin who he hadn't seen in a few years. I thought the reason he gave was strange. If this guy was his cousin, how come he didn't have his number? I told him I wasn't sure which department this other guy worked in, but I just knew of him. The next day at work was normal. I trained Brian and he was catching on quickly. He was still asking about this other guy though, and at that point I knew something was up. I tried my best to ignore him and just continued working. At the end of our shift, we all exited the building. Me and Brian walked out of the building together like we did the day before. That is when I spotted the other guy he had been asking about. I tried to act like I didn't see the other guy, but Brian spotted him right after I did. Before I knew it, Brian began approaching this guy, and that's when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a screwdriver. I yelled the other guy's name, and he turned around quickly before Brian could attack him with the screwdriver. He punched Brian in his face, and some of the other guys held Brian down until 2 security officers came and took the situation under control. As the security officers were walking the Brian down to their office, he looked at me and yelled, "Snitch." I walked over to the other guy who, like I said, I didn't know real well but enough to find out what was going on. I found out that Brian and the other guy's brother had spent time together in prison, and there was some unresolved beef that Brian had with his brother. Because Brian couldn't get to his brother, he was trying to attack this other guy to send a message. I never saw Brian again since that day, but I'm always on the lookout because he seems like the kind of idiot who holds grudges. Stay spooked.
The story I'm about to tell you happened to my coworker about 3 years ago. At the time, I was working at an insurance agency, and for the most part I liked most of my coworkers. There was one coworker that nobody liked. Let's call this coworker Danielle. Danielle was one of those people who liked to put other people down. She liked to make herself seem more important than she was. Our manager didn't even like her, but no matter how bad of a personality she had or how bad she was at her job, he couldn't fire her. She was having an affair with the owner of our agency, who was married, by the way. I should mention that Danielle also had a boyfriend. We all knew the owner's wife, and she was quite the opposite of Danielle. She was very nice. She often brought food into the office and would sometimes come in to help us out when someone called out. When she would come into the office, Danielle would always conveniently be sick. One day our boss and Danielle had gone out for lunch together, and his wife, who we will call Morgan, showed up. She asked us if we knew where her husband Mike was, as she had been calling him the entire morning. We all said we didn't know where he was, and she left. About 30 minutes later, Mike and Danielle arrived back at the office. It was pretty obvious to us what they had been doing, and I'll just leave the rest to the imagination. Right after they stepped into the office, Morgan came through the door and began asking Mike and Danielle what was going on between the two of them. For the first time since I met her, Danielle looked nervous. Mike asked his wife if she could step into his office so they could discuss the issue privately. She refused, and that's when she pulled a weapon from her purse and pointed it at Danielle. We all tried to calm Morgan down by telling her that hurting Danielle wasn't worth it. She stepped closer to Danielle, and that's when her weapon went off, injuring Danielle in the shoulder. She fell to the ground, and even though none of us liked her, we all rushed to help her. One of my coworkers called 911 and the police and ambulance came right after we heard a loud bang outside. Mike went outside after the loud bang, and when he came back inside, he was crying hysterically, and he fell to the ground. The police arrived and asked us to vacate the building. That's when we realized that Morgan had done the unthinkable to herself while sitting in her car. Danielle and Morgan were taken away by 2 separate ambulances. Mike was questioned by the police. The rest of us were asked if we needed any medical attention, which we refused. My ears were ringing, but the paramedics said if it didn't stop by the next morning, I should go to the hospital. The office was closed for about a week, and when we all returned to work, we were informed that there would be a new broker taking over. We never saw Mike or Danielle after the incident. One of my coworkers said that she saw on Facebook that Morgan had passed away from her self-inflicted injuries. Danielle had also met her demise when her boyfriend found about her and Mike's affair. Her boyfriend was very angry and ended her as well. This is the kind of thing that you're not expecting to happen to you when you walk into work. This story will traumatize me for the rest of my life. Thank you for listening. Stay spooked.